On June 25th, 2009, Michael Jackson died. Minutes later, the most profitable version of Michael Jackson was born. And 16 years later, Forbes still names him the highest earning dead celebrity on the planet, routinely out-earning living artists that sell out stadiums. Michael's estate has pulled in more money in death than he generated in his entire 45-year career. And that career included Thriller, the best-selling album of all time. Sit with that for a second. Michael Jackson is worth more dead than alive. His image is so valuable that every system around it reaches in for a piece. The Sony ATV catalog stake that Michael fought so hard to keep was sold off for $750 million after his death. The released FBI files run 333 pages, covering threats against Michael, allegations, investigative assistance, and the 2005 trial that ended in full acquittal on all 10 counts. But public judgment never really ended. Michael's pain was turned into a Coliseum spectacle while he was alive, and now it feeds on his image. The law cleared his name, yet the scandal is kept on life support. And still, his image only grows more valuable. This is the story of a man from a dying steel town in Indiana who became a self-made myth, and then watched his image become something even he could no longer fully control. The new biopic arrives promising to settle a legacy. But with Michael Jackson, the battle never really ends. The image has grown so large that the real man behind it is almost impossible to see. This is the story of how Michael Jackson became too big to control. It's the late 1950s in Gary, Indiana, a steel town built on two things: sweat and schedule. Clock in, do the job, clock out, and repeat. And this life shaped how people thought about time and effort. Hard work in, finished product out. Joe Jackson worked as a crane operator at Inland Steel Company. Tough, mind-numbing work. He played guitar at night to escape it. He also saw something in his children that the mill didn't have: raw talent. Raw talent that could be trained, honed, and packaged as a product and sent into the world on his own terms. And what followed for his children was not a typical childhood. Michael loved music. He felt it like a compulsion. But in the Jackson house, love never canceled out labor. After school, they had another shift. Rehearsals until midnight, then studio sessions and long drives to auditions. They played talent shows in smoke-heavy clubs for rooms full of adults, where every song was a bid for the family's survival. Joe Jackson understood that in a town like Gary, if you weren't extraordinary, you were nothing. In his memoir, Moonwalk, Michael compared his childhood to a sharecropper's, finding no better alternative to describe physical exhaustion, severe pressure, and fear forced on a child's shoulders. And the same system that made Michael the most famous entertainer on the planet also left wounds that never healed. Joe Jackson is easy to cast as a villain, but Michael himself credits his father with the blueprint: discipline, preparation, and cold-eyed sense of what the family could become. But he also described a childhood full of fear, punishment, and an emotional distance, leaving Michael to spend his adulthood chasing a childhood he never had.
You know, and he practiced us with a belt in his hand. And if you miss a step, expect to be... He would lose his temper. I just remember hearing my mother scream, "Joe, you're gonna kill him, you're gonna kill him, stop it, you're gonna kill him," you know, and I was so fast, you know, he couldn't catch me half the time, but when he would catch me, oh my God, it was bad.
What Joe had built at home, Motown had already been running at scale. Berry Gordy had worked the assembly line at Ford before founding Motown, and he was explicit about the model he had in mind. Raw talent came in, then choreographers, vocal coaches, etiquette instructors, and publicity managers worked on that talent, and the result was a star. Gordy ran the label like a factory boss and a family patriarch, which felt entirely natural to a kid raised in the shadow of steel mill workers. Michael watched it all from the inside. Producers tearing a song apart take after take in search of perfection. Image decisions being made by people around the artist, but never by the artist. He saw the gap between the truth and the myth the public was allowed to hear. The legend says that Diana Ross discovered the Jackson 5 at the talent show. It's a clean selling story, but it's also not true. The road to Motown was longer and way harder than the story suggested. But the beautiful story was one that traveled, because a magical story was beautiful and memorable, and that mattered more than the truth. That was the ultimate lesson. Before Michael Jackson became trapped inside a myth, he watched exactly how one gets built. Now, here is the frame that almost nobody gets right. In September of 1977, while Michael was still a teenager, over 2,000 steelworkers in Gary were classified for trade adjustment assistants, a bureaucratic phrase for your labor is no longer needed.
Some of the workers at U.S. Steel's big plant in Gary, Indiana. Today, the company shut down the last of its open hearth furnaces in Gary.
At shift change this morning, some of the men have been notified this would be their last day's work. In all, 2,500 men will be laid off over the next 2 weeks.
That same year, 20,000 steel jobs vanished across the Midwest. Mills were dying, replaced by a new economy built on finance and services rather than sweat and steel. The towns that had built modern America were suddenly told they were obsolete. Michael released Thriller in 1982. The same year, the industrial collapse reached its peak. The heartland that built the Jackson family was being taken apart at the precise moment the son of a crane operator was becoming the most famous person on Earth. That wasn't a simple coincidence. It's the kind of historical irony that only becomes visible when you step back far enough to see the whole picture.
Actually, you're becoming like a stage addict. I really am. Like when there are off days and there is no show, I'm up at night dancing just to sing. It's really strange. Guess I'm an addict. Can't help it.
People saw in Michael a discipline they understood. Relentless mechanical precision that once lived inside factory walls. But Michael was using that grit to build something else. He was becoming a global star. By mastering the machinery of fame his father and Motown had taught him, he turned himself into a product so massive that no one could steer it anymore. By the late 70s, Michael Jackson realized a dangerous truth. Fame and image are not the same thing, and fame without a controlled image is always fragile. He'd spent his childhood watching Motown build the frame around him, and now he was going to build his own. The transition began when he met Quincy Jones on the set of The Wiz in 1978. Quincy saw a musical maturity in Michael that the Jackson 5 format had been too small to hold. Later, Off the Wall was the first result of that collaboration. Thriller was the second. But music was only one part of the construction. He was determined to be more than a singer. He was building a figure, a persona. Every piece of his famous look was engineered. The fedora casting a shadow across his eyes and creating mystery in silhouette. The single sparkling glove forcing the eye to follow the hand. The glittering white socks against cropped black trousers ensured his footwork remained visible even from the furthest seat. These were design decisions that commanded the eye. Michael was thinking about iconization. How do you stay recognizable on a grainy 4-inch TV, a 40-foot billboard, or a child's crayon drawing. He stripped himself down to a pure silhouette. He became an icon. His dancing carried the same captivation. Michael spent his life obsessed with a single mantra: study the greats and become greater. His moves drew from nearly a century of performance tradition, from Cab Calloway and James Brown to Fred Astaire, Gene Kelly, and street dancers. In his autobiography, Michael described dance as something people innovate and create. Dance was something you studied, practiced until exhaustion, and worked on until it was perfect. From white tape on fingers to exact head angles, all was calculated.
Where did the moonwalk come from, actually?
Well, the moonwalk came from these beautiful children, these black kids who live in the ghettos and, you know, the inner cities, who are brilliant. They just have that natural talent for dancing. Any of the new hot, the Running Man, any of these dances, they come up with these dances. All I did was enhance the dance.
Even the moonwalk was something Michael adopted from street dancers and refined in front of the mirror for weeks in preparation for a very special moment. What happened at Motown 25 was not a miracle in any magical sense, but a strategic deployment of a finished product. A century of dance history channeled through a body that had been trained since the age of 5, dropped in front of an audience at the exact moment he wanted us to see it. On that stage, he turned meticulous work into something that looked like magic. And that was the trick. But the more total the magic got, the harder it became to find the actual person behind that image. That was partly by design, and it worked exactly as intended. But it was also the beginning of a trap Michael could not yet see. And Thriller showed him exactly how big that trap could become. You see, before Michael, stars were essentially high-level employees for the labels. They worked for their industry. But after Thriller, that flipped. The industry couldn't move without him. From a struggling channel to popularization of MTV to the way Pepsi reached the globe, Michael turned from another worker for the reason that they blew up at the time, becoming the gravity that held the cultural economy together. The numbers from the next decade are hard to process without Michael Jackson's mythology to soften them. Between 1987 and 1997, Michael performed live for over 12 million people across 35 countries, with the majority being outside the United States. 7 sold-out nights at Wembley, same-scale crowds in Mexico City, Bucharest, Tokyo. When the This Is It shows were announced in 2009, the demand crashed ticketing platforms worldwide within mere hours. But these numbers hide a truth that's rarely talked about. The entire stadium touring circuit that allows artists to build generational wealth independent of record sales was effectively closed to black acts. The reason came packaged as risk assessments, inflated insurance costs, and structural resistance from venues to large gatherings with predominantly black audiences. Michael Jackson shattered that racial glass ceiling in the global touring industry that forced the music business industry to change a bit. Nonetheless, even decades later, the gap remained. A 2002 study of top 35 touring acts in the world found only one black artist on the list. And even Michael's most famous rival, Prince, couldn't break through that ceiling until 2004. Yet Michael Jackson had. When he fully filled those stadiums, he was occupying space that industry had never built for him, and didn't leave the door open for others looking like him. Michael understood what it meant, and from it he drew a conclusion that doesn't get talked about enough. He stopped touring America entirely. The same country that built steel towns, built Joe Jackson, and built Michael Jackson had no equal space for what he became. So he took that massive economic and cultural machine he had built and moved it out of America's reach. And that refusal shaped the next decade of Michael's life. The stage had given him everything fame could offer, But fame, in the end, was just attention. But attention isn't the same thing as power. Real power looked like something else entirely. Although fame was powerful, ownership was the strongest asset. Ownership made the industry reckon with him on his own terms. Michael understood the difference before most artists are willing to think about it clearly. That artistry and business are two separate jobs. The advice came from a Beatle, Paul McCartney. During their early 80s collaborations, Paul told Michael that the real money wasn't in the performance, but in owning publishing rights. And it's exactly this friendly advice that Paul would soon come to regret.
So it was very nice. We had a really good time. We made a couple of records together, did a video, and we're very good friends. It actually kind of fell apart a little bit later because he was talking to me and asking my business advice. And one of the things I said to him was, think about getting into music publishing. And then he looked at me kind of, I thought he was joking. He said, I'm going to get yours.
Oh, yeah.
So, I kind of thought, oh, you. But it turned out to be true. And
in 1985, Michael purchased ATV Music Publishing for $47 million. The catalog included hundreds of songs, and among them, the publishing rights for a substantial share of the Beatles songs. Owning the publishing rights meant that every time a song from the catalog was played on the radio, used in a movie or a commercial, and covered, sampled, or streamed, a royalty was paid. Paid not to the composer, but the owner. Now, the child star who once belonged to a label became the man who owned songs labels needed. Throughout the years, Michael's collection grew. Bad in 1987, Dangerous in 91, History in 95, world tours that shattered records on every continent, and the ATV catalog running quietly in the background, generating revenue. Then, in 1995, Michael made his second major move, the one that would define the most complicated chapter of his business life. He merged ATV with Sony's publishing division, forming Sony ATV Music Publishing, a 50-50 joint venture. The combined catalog became one of the most valuable global music publishing entities, and Michael retained equal ownership. What he'd purchased for $47 million a decade earlier had grown into something incomprehensibly large. But the merger came with one condition. His greatest source of independent power was now shared with the largest musical corporation on earth. That shift from performer to proprietor is the side of Michael Jackson that gets easily lost among Michael Jackson stories. It gave him a form of power and leverage inside the industry that a celebrity alone never could possess. Michael's King of Pop title was a crown, but his real crown was this catalog. And within only a few years, his real crown was going to paint a target on his back that mere fame never could. The merger placed Michael in one of the strangest positions in entertainment history. He was simultaneously one of Sony's most valuable recording artists and one of its most powerful business partners. Those two relationships now lived inside the same contract, and the arrangement worked until it didn't. By the early 2000s, Michael was publicly accusing Sony and its chairman Tommy Mottola of refusing to promote Michael's new album, Invincible. And he went further. He accused Mottola of manipulating the industry against black artists and targeting him specifically because the catalog made him worth going after.
The record companies really, really do conspire against their artists. They steal, they cheat, they do whatever they can, especially the black artists. Sony, Tommy Mottola. Tommy Mottola is the president of the record division. He is a mean, he's a racist, and he's very, very, very devilish.
Mottola denied all of it. Barry Gordy, who'd known Michael since childhood, reportedly warned him that framing the dispute in racial terms was dangerous and would not serve Michael well. What happened in public was documented extensively, yet what received almost no attention was the quieter side of the conflict that had been building for years before it even made the news. After the Bad Tour, Michael Jackson never toured the United States again. By 2002, his refusal to tour in support of Invincible and Sony's withdrawal of the album's promotion, as well as his public accusations against Mottola, had collectively broken the relationship and ended the recording contract 4 years ahead of schedule. Michael had not performed on the American mainland since 1993. With both the fury of the abuse allegations and the trap of a racial ceiling glass effectively exiling him from his own country. The man who could draw 500,000 people to a single city chose consistently to give those performances in Britain, in Germany, in Japan, anywhere but home. Outside America, Michael Jackson was treated as what he was, one of the most consequential and respected artists in the history of pop music. But inside America, his life was reduced to a battlefield of contested stories about race, money, and scandals, as Michael suggested. There was no longer clean space in American culture for a black artist who became that large and that independent. Sony was less of an enemy and more of a suffocating partner he couldn't get away from. And in the music industry, power doesn't confine itself to mere headlines. It lives in the wordings of contract clauses, the fine print of loan agreements, and the terms of the collateral. Speaking of collateral, Michael used his stake in the Sony ADV catalog to secure massive debt and fund his life and fund his vision, including Neverland. This very catalog that was meant to be his fortress had become a chain, tying him to the machine. Michael was powerful enough to challenge the system in public, yet he was entangled enough that the system could challenge him back in private, through paperwork, without a single headline required. But headlines were coming regardless. Michael Jackson was acquitted in the 2005 criminal trial, not guilty on all 10 counts. That is the legal record. The courtroom can return a verdict, but the media machine keeps the scandal on life support. The first allegations had surfaced in 1993. Michael wanted to fight them, but his advisors persuaded him to settle it quietly, out of court, to end the so-called terrible publicity, with no admission of wrongdoing. It was a decision Michael would later say he deeply regretted, because the settlement didn't close the story, but fueled it more. An unresolved allegation is more selling than a conviction. A conviction ends the story, but an allegation keeps it open indefinitely. Instead of a clean victory, he bought a permanent question mark and a target on his back with a dollar figure attached to it. In 2003, journalist Martin Bashir released Living with Michael Jackson, a documentary built on months of close access that Michael had granted him in hopes of rehabilitating his public image. But what aired did the opposite. Bashir's framing presented Michael's relationship with children as troubling and worrisome, and just within months, new criminal allegations had been filed. With these criminal charges, Michael fought till the very end. 12 years after the first allegations, he went through a full trial and was acquitted on all 10 counts. That was the problem for the media. A full stop kills the story, but an unresolved case is a guaranteed revenue stream. Every anniversary, every new accuser, every documentary, just another cycle. It proved that it didn't need a conviction. It needed controversy.
Remember something, just because it's in print doesn't mean it's the gospel. People write negative things because they feel that's what sells. Good news to them doesn't sell.
And while the controversy ran, the debt was running too. After the 2005 trial, the pressure intensified. Michael Jackson was still enormously valuable on paper, but economically paralyzed.
This guy's been cash-strapped for some time, but he's still asset-rich.
His Sony ATV stake was used as collateral against significant debt, which meant the catalog, the thing that he had built as proof of his independence, was partially in the hands of his creditors. And once the real crown becomes collateral, ownership stops being pure power. It becomes a negotiation with the people holding the clock. By the time This Is It was announced in 2009, he was 50 years old and had been performing since 1963. His body carried the evidence of childhood labor. A Pepsi commercial accident that caused permanent physical damage to his scalp, which started his addiction to painkillers, and also a slower kind of deterioration that comes from living under constant legal and financial stress. The world around Michael had become crowded in ways that was hard to navigate from the inside. Different managers circulated through LA, making competing claims on his authority. Promoters needed him committed to a timeline. Creditors needed him credit-worthy. Fans needed him to reproduce the body and the precision of the 80s Michael. Everyone needed something from him, and everybody believed that their claim was the legitimate one. In reality, the comeback was not a choice. It was a financial inevitability dressed as an artistic return. Yet the world saw a comeback. What Michael saw was a room full of people all pulling in different directions. Too many hands and one body in the middle expected to hold it together through 50 shows. Michael Jackson died on June 25, 2009 from acute propofol intoxication. Michael had become dependent on this powerful anesthetic while fighting severe insomnia. But propofol isn't natural rest. It pushes the brain into unconsciousness, and without proper monitoring, it can suppress breathing. Conrad Murray was the doctor trusted to manage that risk. He was later convicted of involuntary manslaughter. In the summer of 2009, the body stopped, but the machine Michael built kept running. When Michael died, the systems that orbited Michael didn't dissolve, but just reorganized. John Branca, the lawyer who helped secure the 1985 ATV deal, had been pushed out of Michael's orbit in 2003 over questionable dealings with Michael's finances.
Yeah, there was a will in 1995, a will in 1997, and a will in 2002, and they were all very similar in the structure of the way they distributed the estate, but each one had to recognize either the birth of a kid or the marriage or, of Debbie Rowe or, whatever, or Lisa Marie Presley.
Right.
So that they all appointed me as co-executor.
A trail of wills led to Michael's third will, the final 2002 document that brought Branca back as co-executor of the Michael Jackson estate. Within days of Michael's death, that estate moved to stabilize a financial situation that by most accounts was hanging by a thread. And what followed was the most remarkable reversal in entertainment business history. The This Is It documentary was assembled from Michael's last rehearsal footage and became one of the highest grossing concert films ever made. A Broadway musical and Cirque du Soleil shows followed. There are two ways to read this. To fans, it was resurrection, the MJ empire saved from financial collapse. To critics, it was a cold demonstration, proof that the machine could run more smoothly once the human being was gone. In 2016, Sony purchased Michael's remaining 50% stake in the Sony ATV catalog from the estate for $750 million. What Michael had fought to own as his proof of independence was sold to fund the estate's financial recovery and clean up the debts Michael left behind. The biopic is simply the latest chapter in the same ongoing work on the Michael Jackson myth. Every creative decision is also one about which Michael gets preserved, which version gets authorized, and which parts of his life get smoothed over. Death did not end the battle for Michael Jackson's image. It only sanctified it. The man who grew up among Gary's steelworkers became a global myth at the precise moment that industrial America was being dismantled city by city. His virtuosity offered a fantasy that relentless discipline could produce excellence, and a body shaped by that logic could achieve something great. and the world wanted that fantasy sustained indefinitely, regardless of what the body behind it was actually capable of in 2009. Michael escaped Gary to build Neverland. By the time he died, the Gary that raised him had been hollowed out, and Neverland, which was supposed to be his refuge, became the place where the dream and the allegations fused into a wound he could never return.
I won't live there ever again. I'll visit Neverland. It's a house now, it's not a home anymore. I'll only visit there.
One place taught him the price of fame. The other showed him that even refuge could be taken away. And still, none of it fully contained him. Michael became too profitable to disappear, too famous for privacy, too loved to be dismissed, and too wounded to be at peace. Once the world learned how many versions of him it could sell, defend, attack, and resurrect, the man could no longer hold the image together. He became too big to control. Fragmented by fame, Michael Jackson became an institution. Some artists leave behind a musical legacy, but Michael Jackson left behind a whole industry. One that still sells him, still protects him, rewrites him, attacks and resurrects him every time the world needs another version. The man is gone. His image is still contested, and the hands reaching for it have never stopped. If you made it this far, please subscribe, like the video, and watch the next documentary on this channel.